Here at New Windsor, 7 miles north of West Point, was our last great Revolutionary War camp. Here, close to the Hudson, was the gateway to our republic, the place where many believe America scored one of her greatest triumphs. It was here, right on this spot, that a basic principle of our democracy, the supremacy of the civilian over the soldier, was seriously challenged. And here is where it triumphed over a plot for military dictatorship. But how did this all come about? Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's turn back to the pages of history. His first name was George. At 14, he wanted to join the Navy and wept when his mother wouldn't allow him to leave home. At 16, he had already gone into business, working as a surveyor for Lord Fairfax, who owned 1/4 of what was then Virginia. At 19, this same George, whose last name was Washington, had risen to the rank of major in Great Britain's Virginia militia. A dangerous mission had to be performed. The governor called for volunteers. Washington responded to the call. Its purpose was to discover possible evidence of a French and Indian invasion from Canada down the Ohio River. It was the worst winter on record. Creeks were swollen, snows were deep. The wilderness was inhabited by savage Indian tribes, many of whom were loyal to the French. Washington carried a warning from the governor of Virginia to the French commander not to trespass on Virginia territory. At Fort LeBoeuf, near Lake Erie, Washington discovered clear evidence of a planned invasion. He counted over 220 canoes. If the news was to reach Virginia in time, there was no choice but to leave worn-out horses and take a shortcut through difficult terrain with just one trusted companion. An Indian offered his services as guide, then suddenly turned and fired on them. They disarmed him and sent him home and quickly continued their journey. On the banks of the Allegheny River, they built a raft. Halfway across, Washington lost his footing and fell into the icy waters. On reaching the opposite shore, they found a trading post nearby and delivered the warning of the French invasion. Soon the British and French are at war. Washington, now 22 and a lieutenant colonel, is sent again into the territory to protect British interests, but is forced to capitulate to the French at Fort Necessity, ironically, on July the 4th, 1754. The following year, he again moves against the French and Indians, this time as an aide to General Braddock. The British are caught in an ambush and suffer terrible losses. General Braddock is killed, and Washington is one of the few surviving officers. At the age of 25, Washington meets and falls in love with Martha Custis, whose first husband had died, leaving her with 2 children. Later, he and Martha marry and make their home at Mount Vernon, where they enjoy the pleasures of country living. Meanwhile, the American colonies are beginning to resist British rule. There are protests and demonstrations in the streets. British troops are sent to reinforce New England garrisons, and to enforce hated taxes and other burdensome restrictions. There is a bloody massacre in Boston, and patriots are killed. Then, in April 1775, the British determined to seize arms and military supplies being assembled by the colonists. Paul Revere sounds the alarm. The regulars are coming. Colonists are aroused from their beds. Minutemen answer the call to arms. The Battle of Lexington is followed by another at Concord. The British are beaten back and retreat towards Boston. Men are killed on both sides. Tree of Liberty is nourished by the blood of patriots. At Bunker Hill, the British are for a time repulsed. Washington arrives and takes command of the troops at Cambridge. Up at Fort Ticonderoga, Ethan Allen surprises the British commandant. Surrender in the name of the great God Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Much needed artillery is captured by the Americans. Colonel Henry Knox manages to transport the captured cannon and war supplies all the way from Ticonderoga to Boston, a journey of some 300 miles. After a long siege, Charleston is set ablaze. Lord Howe uses the British fleet to evacuate Boston. But he decides to strike at another American city and lands 32,000 British and German regulars in the vicinity of New York. Both British and Americans skirmish for favorable positions. Washington takes part in the battle for Long Island. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, he is fortunate in being able to withdraw his entire army to Manhattan. Washington then pushes on to White Plains, and later he orders a further retreat north along the Hudson. The American forts Washington and Lee on the Hudson are captured by the British, and Washington again is forced to lead a retreat across New Jersey and the Delaware River. With his remaining troops, he recrosses the Delaware on Christmas night and attacks the enemy's outposts at Trenton, while the unsuspecting soldiers are still feasting and celebrating. It is fearfully cold and raw. A snowstorm is setting in. The wind is northeast and beats in the faces of the men. The attack on Trenton completely surprises the enemy. Washington's men have killed or wounded more than 100 Hessians and taken nearly 1,000 prisoners. The Hessian commander, Colonel Rahl, is wounded and surrenders to Washington. Then follows another victory at Princeton. But General Mercer is mortally wounded and meets a hero's death. General DeKalb is killed. Washington leads his men into winter camp at Morristown. Next year, Washington orders Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery on the Hudson River to be strengthened. The river must be protected at all costs. He orders a chain to be forged and placed across the river near Bear Mountain. The dispatches bring bad news. 7,000 British regulars and Indians under General Burgoyne are moving down from Canada and have recaptured Fort Ticonderoga in the north. Next, they try to follow up this success in Vermont, but are badly defeated by the Americans near Bennington. In Pennsylvania, Washington is hard-pressed at Brandywine. Again, he retreats, but less than a month later, he is pressing the enemy at Germantown. We fight, take our losses, and fight again. Burgoyne continues advancing, but through difficult terrain toward Albany. To slow his march, woodsmen cut trees to block the roads and trails. At Saratoga, Burgoyne is cut off from his supplies, beaten, and forced to surrender. On the Hudson, the British managed to capture Forts Clinton and Montgomery. They cut the chain across the river. The Americans are forced to set fire to their ships to prevent them falling into enemy hands. The English sail further up the Hudson and burn Kingston. But American forces swarm around them on all sides, and the British pull back to New York. It is now the winter of 1777. The place is Valley Forge. Fully half our men are without stockings, breeches, or blankets. Again, the patriot cause is at a low ebb. Baron von Steuben arrives at this winter encampment. He is greeted by Washington. He is a professional soldier who has offered his services to the American cause. Immediately, he starts drilling and training the American soldiers, and they gain new confidence in themselves. By spring, the French become our allies. The Americans start building a new fort at West Point. Washington has great regard for the Marquis de Lafayette and gives him the command of an advance corps. The Battle of Monmouth is fought, with defeat suddenly turned into victory by Washington's determination and bravery. Molly Pitcher takes her dead husband's place at the cannon. For 2 more years, the revolution continues without any decisive advantage to either side. There is a mutiny in the Pennsylvania line. Money has become scarce, and what paper money there is worthless. One patriotic woman gives General Greene her entire savings. Then, in July 1780, the French land an army at Newport, Rhode Island, under the Count de Rochambeau. But back on the Hudson, there is bad news for Washington. A plot is discovered to sell the great American fort at West Point to the English for 50,000 pounds. André, a British major, is arrested with the plans of the fort hidden in his boots. He bears a pass from Benedict Arnold, thus exposing the general that Washington had placed in command of West Point as its betrayer. Arnold realizes he will be discovered and flees on horseback to the Hudson, where he manages to evade capture. Washington, in despair, wonders whom he now can trust. At Stony Point, the Americans score a stirring victory. Washington is heartened by having the French army and fleet at his disposal. Finally, at Yorktown, a large British army is trapped. The battle starts with the Americans mounting a heavy bombardment. 3 days later, after the British receive a fearful pounding from our guns, Cornwallis, cut off from retreat by sea, surrenders. Another long period of waiting takes place. The Hudson Highlands are still Washington's center of defense, should the British Army move in any direction. He makes his headquarters at Newburgh and orders his army into winter quarters at New Windsor. It is a large cantonment for 7,000 troops, some of whom are Negroes. It is up the Hudson, just above West Point. Meanwhile, in Paris, negotiations for peace are begun. Rumors of it reach the army. Instead of joy, there is uneasiness, especially among the officers. Pay is in arrears. Accounts are not settled. Promises of retirement pay have not been confirmed. No one has confidence in Congress. Will it forget the soldiers once it has no further need for them? Washington, at his headquarters at Newburgh, learns of a conspiracy against the government. 2 letters have been circulating among the officers at New Windsor, suggesting that the army take control away from Congress. Washington quickly summons a meeting at New Windsor to counter this conspiracy. On reaching the cantonment, he enters a large rectangular building called the Temple, because religious and Masonic rites were often held there by officers. On mounting the balustraded platform, he calls the meeting to order, then searches for his spectacles. "You will pardon me. I have, as you see, grown not only gray, but blind in your service." An anonymous writer has suggested that you either desert your country in the extremest hour of her distress, or turn your arms against it unless Congress can be compelled into instant compliance with your wishes. Gentlemen, let me entreat you, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country. The speech is over. The young officers crowd around him. Some even weep. Unanimously, a crowd of mutineers become loyal officers of the United States. A few days later comes news of the peace. At New Windsor, Washington and his men had opened the gateway to the Republic.